A racist police officer pulls over a woman whom he assumes is just an ordinary citizen, completely unaware that he's about to face a 3-star general and make the gravest mistake of his career. What happens when she makes a single phone call, unleashing the full power of the Pentagon upon him? Inside the sleek black Jeep Grand Cherokee, General Cassandra Ellison, the first African-American woman in U.S. history to hold the rank of 3-star general, carefully adjusts the military-grade GPS mounted on the dashboard. Her finger lightly taps each coordinate, her demeanor calm and authoritative, like an invisible suit of armor wrapped around her. She's not lost. It's just that the roads, after years of constant construction, have distorted the familiar map. Even though she's been stationed here many times, even the most seasoned generals sometimes get disoriented amid the dizzying pace of urbanization. But Cassandra's peaceful thoughts are abruptly interrupted. A flash of bright lights from behind her vehicle suddenly flares up. The familiar red and blue lights she's seen countless times before. She glances into the rearview mirror, feeling the familiar weariness slowly creep up in her mind. "Not again," she mutters softly, a sigh escaping her lips, heavy with all the frustration and exhaustion accumulated over the years. She lowers the window, her hands steady on the steering wheel, her posture cooperative and calm, even though she knows there's nothing suspicious about her stopping the car. Cassandra is all too familiar with situations like this. Far too familiar with being suspected simply because of the color of her skin. The officer steps out of the patrol car, exuding an arrogant air, his eyes cold, his face displaying suspicion and prejudice. Brent Mallory, the officer with a buzz cut, walks quickly toward the Jeep, one hand resting on his belt near his gun, as if preparing for some danger that exists only in his imagination. "Papers," he snaps, his voice sharp like an order from a superior with an unmistakable hint of provocation. "Show me your driver's license and vehicle registration now." Cassandra takes a deep breath, her heartbeat steady, just as she was trained to be during her distinguished military career. She reminds herself to stay composed and calm, qualities that years of military life and battlefield experience have ingrained in her. Slowly, decisively, she replies, her tone even. "I'll get the papers now, officer." Cassandra carefully reaches for the glove compartment on her right, each movement deliberate and clear, as though following military orders. Her parents' words to every black child in America echo in her mind. A rule that became a matter of survival: never make any sudden movements, never create misunderstandings that could lead to unpredictable consequences. However, she knows all too well that this is never enough, because the prejudice and fear in the officer's gaze say it all. No matter how many stars she wears on her shoulders, no matter how many medals are pinned to her chest, to Brent Mallory, she is just another black woman to be viewed with suspicion and caution. "Why did you stop here?" He presses further, his voice tinged with challenge. "I just stopped to adjust my GPS," Cassandra replies calmly, her eyes unwavering. "There's nothing wrong, officer." Brent says nothing more, but his attitude speaks volumes. Cassandra understands that this conversation won't end easily, because she knows he will find any excuse to make things difficult for her. She looks straight ahead, her face as cold as steel, maintaining her dignity and pride. But deep inside, her heart aches with an endless weariness, because, despite bearing the responsibility of defending the nation, despite standing shoulder to shoulder with the highest leaders, she still faces these suspicious, prejudiced looks on the very soil she has dedicated her life to protecting. And right there, on the peaceful road leading into Fort Mitchell, a fateful confrontation is quietly being set in motion, one that will completely change Officer Brent Mallory's life and shake the nation. The tense atmosphere fills the air, and Cassandra knows well. A great storm is waiting for her ahead. But just like all the times before, she's ready to face it, because her life has never been one to back down from what is wrong. Her eyes still shine brightly, the latent power behind her patient exterior. A flashpoint is about to occur, and General Cassandra Ellison, the 3-star general of the U.S. Army, will soon show that officer he picked the wrong person to harass this time. The cold, piercing gaze of Officer Brent Mallory remains fixed on Cassandra, as if he's waiting for her to make the slightest wrong move. His hand is tense, resting near his gun, an unconscious yet clearly threatening gesture, signaling that he has deemed her a potential danger. Cassandra is fully aware of the situation at hand. She's no stranger to such suspicious glares. She's encountered them countless times in her life, but each time, it feels like the first time, bitter and painful. Yet the determination on her face remains unshaken. Every moment of her military career has prepared her to stay calm through any storm, even though this situation is testing her endurance more than any battlefield she's ever faced. "I'm getting the papers from the glove compartment, officer," Cassandra says clearly and slowly, her voice void of any emotion. Mallory merely nods slightly, his eyes still tense as a bowstring. He watches every small movement she makes, his body rigid with alertness, as if facing an invisible enemy. This attitude is not born out of nowhere. It's been shaped by years of police work, but also by the ingrained prejudices he has long accepted. As the son of a stern police officer, Brent Mallory grew up in a military family where orders and discipline were survival necessities. But racial biases were deeply embedded in his mind through hearing his father's comments about cases and suspicious characters, often described as having darker skin. For him, suspicion is a reflex, a survival instinct in a world he was taught to view as full of threats. Cassandra opens the glove compartment slowly, her movements deliberate and extremely cautious, an unspoken declaration that she is not a threat. Every breath, every motion of hers demonstrates the discipline and unwavering mental strength of a general who has faced countless life-or-death situations. But her slowness and calmness seem to make Brent more uncomfortable. He furrows his brow, his cold expression hiding his growing impatience. "Can you hurry up?" Mallory snaps, his voice clearly laced with frustration. "I'm doing it, officer," Cassandra replies, her tone still steady, not allowing him any further chance to provoke her. Finally, Cassandra hands over the documents. Her driver's license, vehicle registration, everything in order, no mistakes. She holds the papers up to his line of sight, her gesture calm but decisive. Her gaze remains fixed ahead, neither challenging nor provocative, but full of self-respect and latent authority. Mallory takes the papers but only glances at them briefly, before looking back at Cassandra, his suspicion unrelenting. "Why did you stop here?" he repeats, as if still unsatisfied with her previous answer. "I've already explained. I stopped to adjust the GPS. I haven't broken any laws," Cassandra repeats, her voice firm and composed, her eyes meeting his for the first time since the conversation began. For a moment, Brent hesitates under the weight of her authoritative gaze, but quickly regains his aggressive posture. He struggles to maintain control of the situation, though a vague sense of confusion begins to emerge within him. He could have ended this encounter quickly, but something in Cassandra's calmness unsettles him, urging him to dig deeper. "Do you have any weapons or dangerous items on you?" Mallory asks, his tone sharper than before. "I am an active-duty soldier. My weapons are safely stored at the military base," Cassandra responds calmly. "Soldier?" Brent sneers, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Or are you just a mechanic for the military?" He can't hide the contempt in his words, deliberately provoking her, hoping to elicit a stronger reaction to justify taking further action. Cassandra doesn't respond. Her silence, filled with pride, is more powerful than any rebuttal. She understands all too well that a hasty reaction on her part would give the officer all the justification he needs to escalate the situation. But Cassandra does not give him that chance. Her composure, her dignity, and her self-respect form an unbreakable steel wall. The two stare at each other, their gazes clashing between authority and prejudice, between poise and irrational suspicion. Time seems to stand still in that moment, the air thick and suffocating with tension. Finally, Brent Mallory takes a step back, inhaling deeply, his gaze still unchanged. A clear truth becomes apparent. He is not going to let this go easily, and Cassandra knows this confrontation is only just beginning. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but long enough for both Cassandra and Brent Mallory to realize that this confrontation wouldn't end easily. Brent took a step back, his hand still near his gun, his eyes filled with suspicion and challenge. The deep-seated prejudices within him now had the chance to rise, overpowering whatever remaining clarity he had. Cassandra calmly observed his every movement through the rearview mirror. She knew full well that her calm demeanor only seemed to provoke the officer further. She didn't want that to happen, but she had no other choice but to maintain her stance and dignity. "Step out of the vehicle," Brent suddenly ordered, his voice sharp, cutting through the tense atmosphere. Cassandra slightly turned her head, keeping her gaze steady on the officer. "I don't understand why I should do that. I'm not being arrested, am I, officer?" Brent didn't answer immediately. His eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched. Cassandra's polite but firm refusal made him feel as though his authority was being challenged, his pride wounded. The sense of losing control only fueled his anger. "I said step out of the vehicle, now!" Brent emphasized each word, his patience now completely gone. Cassandra understood that any act of defiance at this moment would only make things worse. She sighed softly, not out of fear, but because she had grown so accustomed to such unreasonable situations. Slowly, with full control, she unbuckled her seatbelt, gently pushed the door open, and stepped out, each movement filled with dignity yet extreme caution. At this point, the situation was no longer a private matter. Other cars slowed down as they passed by. Pedestrians, curious about the presence of a police vehicle, began to slow down, some even taking out their phones to record what was unfolding. "Look at that, what's going on?" a young woman in a white sedan said loudly, her phone camera pointed at Cassandra and the officer. "She hasn't done anything. Why is she being forced out of the car?" An older man across the street, holding his phone with a puzzled expression, asked. With every passing second, more people gathered to witness, and the pressure from the growing crowd made Mallory even more agitated. For him, the attention from the crowd felt like a public trial, a sensation he loathed. The whispers and murmurs from around him made it seem like the whole world was turning against him. "Turn around and place your hands on the hood now," Brent ordered again, trying to assert his authority by raising his voice further. Cassandra kept a serious expression, but she tried to ease the situation. "Officer, I haven't broken any laws. This is entirely unnecessary." "I'm the one who decides what's necessary. Do you understand?" Brent almost growled, his eyes flashing with anger. Every word he spoke now was filled with rage and tension, as though he had to prove his authority in front of the ever-growing crowd. All around, the phones were raised higher, recording every word, every aggressive gesture from the officer. A young man across the street shouted loudly, filming and making his voice clear. "Why is she being forced out of the car? We're recording this. We have the right to know what's going on." The young man's voice only made Brent more confused and irritated. Facing pressure from all sides, he decided to show even more of his power, forcing Cassandra to submit. He moved closer, lowering his voice but with an unmistakable threat. "Listen here, you may think you're special, but here I decide the law." Cassandra didn't respond. Inside, she felt a deep bitterness. She stood tall, looking ahead, her gaze strong and composed. In that moment, she was a living symbol of strength, a sharp contrast to Brent's loss of control and aggression. The tension in the air was palpable. Videos of the scene quickly appeared on social media. Angry, indignant comments began to flood in, and the eyes watching from the scene became hotter than ever. The once peaceful road had now become the center of attention, where prejudice and power clashed fiercely with dignity and justice. Cassandra understood this fully. Facing the escalating tension, she was ready to stand her ground because she knew the truth was on her side, and it certainly wasn't with Brent Mallory. Amid the rising tension and the growing murmurs from the crowd, Brent Mallory realized he could not back down. The pressure from the phones recording the scene only made him more agitated. The sensation of being scrutinized acted as a stimulant, awakening the arrogance and deep-seated prejudices that had long been hidden within him. He looked at Cassandra with cold, suspicious eyes, his chin tilted up as if trying to assert his superiority. "You say you're a soldier? Hard to believe. Or are you just some mechanic at some base?" Brent's voice was filled with disdain, his words laced with malice, clearly aimed at diminishing Cassandra's worth. He made sure to say it loud enough for everyone around to hear, an effort to prove his absolute control in this situation. Cassandra remained silent, her eyes narrowing slightly, not revealing any emotion, though deep inside she struggled to contain the growing anger. She knew that a single uncontrolled response could become the perfect excuse for the officer to escalate the situation further. "Turn around, hands on the hood now," Brent barked again, losing all patience when he saw Cassandra's lack of response. Cassandra briefly met his gaze, her eyes sharp and filled with self-respect, before slowly turning around, her movements deliberate and controlled. She placed her hands gently on the hood of the black Jeep, each motion firm and dignified, like a soldier, denying Brent any chance to escalate further. Brent rushed forward, his actions hurried and rough. He pulled out his handcuffs, grabbing Cassandra's wrist, violently twisting her arm behind her and securing the cuffs tightly. The cold metal bit into her skin, and Cassandra felt the pressure of the steel digging into her flesh, but her face remained unchanged. "You're not as noble as you think, soldier," Brent sneered, his lips curling into a mocking smile. He pushed Cassandra forcefully down onto the hood of the car. Her body was slammed onto the hot metal surface, burning from the sun's heat. Her cheek touched the hood, the heat seeming to try to scorch her dignity, but Cassandra didn't let a flicker of her resolve slip away, not even for a second. Around them, the crowd's shouts immediately erupted, growing louder and more intense. "Stop it! What are you doing? She hasn't done anything wrong. We're recording this. You can't treat her like this." As the crowd grew more enraged, Brent became more determined to prove his authority. A wave of anger rose within him, not because Cassandra had broken the law, but simply because he couldn't accept that a black woman could face him with such cold strength and defiance. "This is the consequence of trying to act all high and mighty with the police," Brent whispered venomously as he leaned close to Cassandra, just enough for her to hear. Cassandra didn't reply. In that moment, she realized that her endurance was the most powerful weapon she had at her disposal. She controlled her heartbeat, keeping her breathing steady, her gaze still fixed ahead, refusing to let her emotions take control, even as the insults rang in her ears. Phones continued to record every second of the incident. The image of a senior military woman being treated so brutally on the streets of America, at the hands of a prejudiced officer, quickly spread across social media. The video was shared at lightning speed, drawing countless angry reactions from the public. At the scene, the atmosphere grew more charged, the tension almost suffocating. Witnesses began to step out of their cars, moving closer, voicing their protests against Brent's actions. "Let her go, right now. This is completely unjust. Why are you handcuffing her when she hasn't done anything wrong?" The protests grew louder, but Brent remained obstinate, ignoring every shout. He stood tall, glancing around in anger and defiance, even though he could feel the control of the situation slipping further from his grasp. Cassandra remained in that position, her face pressed against the hood, but her eyes burned with a fierce, unwavering resolve. She knew the situation had escalated far beyond what she could have expected. But no matter how much Brent tried to overpower her with his authority, he would never break her spirit. Because the strength of Cassandra Ellison had never been in the stars on her shoulders or the medals on her chest, but in the deep-seated self-respect and inner strength she carried within her. In that moment of injustice and indignity, Cassandra stood firm like a living monument, silent but full of pride, ready to face any challenge, no matter how brutal the unfairness. And it was in that moment that the silent battle between dignity and prejudice began to turn into a public struggle that Brent Mallory could never have anticipated. At the height of the tense moment, from across the street, Captain Miguel Herrera, a young military officer on his way back to the base, happened to notice the crowd gathering and the loud shouts. His professional instinct told him something was wrong. Miguel slowed down and parked his gray sedan at the curb, his gaze fixed on the police car and the figure of a woman being pushed down onto the hood. Realizing the unusual situation, he quickly pulled out his phone and began recording the scene before him, his eyes alert, focused, and serious. Through the phone screen, Miguel immediately noticed the woman's posture. She stood tall, her demeanor strong, filled with self-respect and discipline. He furrowed his brow. Only those who had undergone strict military training could maintain such calm and proper posture, even while enduring rough treatment. On the other side, Brent Mallory continued to shout, trying to assert his authority by humiliating Cassandra in front of the increasingly vocal crowd. Miguel moved closer, slipping through a few people standing nearby, trying to hear more clearly the words being exchanged between the officer and the woman. It was then that Cassandra's calm yet strong voice rang out clearly, cutting through the tense air. "I am Cassandra Ellison, Brigadier General of the U.S. Army, 3-star rank, stationed at Fort Mitchell. You have just unlawfully arrested a senior military officer." Cassandra's declaration instantly silenced the entire scene. The crowd's shouts stopped abruptly, replaced by stunned and astonished gazes. People filming instinctively moved their phones closer, trying to capture every detail of this unexpected confrontation. Brent Mallory froze for a moment, his eyes showing clear confusion, but soon after he let out a mocking laugh, trying to hide his growing anxiety with clumsy sarcasm. "A general? What a joke, Mrs. Ellison. Anyone can claim to be someone when they're being arrested." At that moment, Miguel Herrera could no longer remain silent. He stepped out of the crowd quickly, raising his phone high and speaking loudly and clearly. "I am Captain Miguel Herrera, U.S. Army, stationed at Fort Mitchell. I confirm the identity of this woman. She is Brigadier General Cassandra Ellison, a 3-star general, well known in the military. I demand that you release her immediately and stop this absurd action." Each word Miguel spoke was strong and clear, like a sharp blade cutting through the heavy atmosphere. His gaze was directed straight at Brent, full of challenge and authority. Mallory stared at Miguel, a sense of confusion and fear beginning to spread across his face. He hadn't expected that what started as a simple situation would now take a sudden turn into a serious event that he no longer had control over. "What did you say? A general?" Brent stammered, trying to conceal the fear that was slowly overtaking his mind. "That's exactly right," Miguel replied firmly, his voice unwavering. "You're unlawfully arresting a U.S. Army Brigadier General. Everything is being recorded clearly, and I assure you the consequences will be severe if you don't release her immediately." The crowd instantly began buzzing, murmurs growing louder. Phones continued to record, and the shocking truth that had just been revealed made the public's anger grow even stronger. He arrested a general. Unbelievable! "You heard that right, officer. Let her go immediately." Mallory realized the situation was now entirely turning against him, but his pride and fear kept him from surrendering in front of the crowd. He clenched his jaw, trying to find some excuse to defend himself, but no justification came. Cassandra maintained her strong posture. Even though her wrists were still handcuffed, she could now feel that her power and dignity were unyielding. Her voice rang out again, cold and commanding. "You may continue to hold me here if you wish, but I assure you that the consequences you will face will far exceed anything you can imagine." In that moment, Brent Mallory felt the ground beneath him shake. His prejudice and arrogance had just been struck with the hardest blow he had ever received. Now, it wasn't Cassandra Ellison confronting him anymore. He was now facing the truth that he had tried to deny from the start. He had made a grave mistake. A mistake that could bury his career and his honor forever. As Brent Mallory stood in shock, his mind spinning, desperately trying to regain control of the situation, the distant sky suddenly roared with the deep, heavy sound of an engine. The noise grew louder and louder, cutting through the tense air, creating an invisible pressure that enveloped the entire scene. Everyone, both the angry crowd and the panicked police officer, looked up toward the horizon. A dark, gray military helicopter was approaching, its massive, imposing form becoming clearer with each thunderous engine blast. The air immediately grew stifling, vibrating with the undeniable power of the military's unmistakable symbol of authority. Mallory stood frozen, his face pale, as he realized the situation had escalated beyond anything he could have imagined. He had never thought that what seemed like a simple arrest could attract such high-level intervention. The helicopter landed on a nearby patch of open ground, the blades whipping the air so violently that the trees along the road bent fiercely. At the same time, a glossy black SUV with government plates sped toward the parked vehicles. Before it could even come to a complete stop, the rear door swung open, and a woman in a dark blue uniform stepped out. It was Colonel Teresa Maddox, the person directly responsible for overseeing special operations at the Pentagon. Teresa moved with authority, swift and decisive, her sharp eyes cutting straight through the chaos to focus on Brent Mallory. She paid no mind to the surrounding noise and commotion, her sole focus on the police officer who had caused this serious disruption. Brent stood rooted to the spot, his throat dry. He had never faced such overwhelming power as Teresa Maddox approached him. She stopped right in front of him, her voice cold, strong, and unyielding as she spoke. "I am Colonel Teresa Maddox, U.S. Department of Defense. I demand that you release Brigadier General Cassandra Ellison immediately, unconditionally." Brent tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. He could only stammer a few meaningless syllables, his eyes wide with confusion and panic. His initial arrogance had completely evaporated, replaced by a profound fear as he realized he had unknowingly confronted a force he had never imagined, the highest levels of the U.S. military. Teresa didn't give him time to justify himself. Her gaze became even sharper, and her voice, filled with authority, rang out clearly. "Are you fully aware of the serious consequences of unlawfully detaining a senior military officer? This action will not only have direct consequences for you, but it will also expose the entire police force here to severe legal repercussions from the federal government." Teresa's words were sharp as a knife, each one carrying the weight of undeniable power. Brent felt as if every excuse and defense he had built up became meaningless in the face of this authoritative woman. His legs shook, his mind spiraled into panic, and he couldn't think of a single coherent thing to say. Teresa didn't wait for Brent to respond. She walked directly to Cassandra, took the key from a nearby military officer, and unlocked her handcuffs. As the cold cuffs fell to the ground, Cassandra stood up slowly, her face devoid of bitterness or emotion, only pride and the commanding dignity of a soldier who had overcome a difficult battle. Brent Mallory watched, feeling as if he had just been struck directly in his pride and his career. The harsh reality was clear before him. He had completely failed in his confrontation with the woman he had once underestimated, and now he was paying the price with his own honor. The entire scene fell into complete silence, with only the powerful hum of the helicopter's engines in the distance. The eyes of hundreds of onlookers were fixed on Brent, but not a single word was spoken, because everyone understood that the authority from Washington, D.C. had arrived, bringing an end to this senseless confrontation. And in that moment of overwhelming power, Brent Mallory finally realized that his blind prejudice had led to a consequence he could never undo, a consequence so large it would destroy everything he had worked for in his life. In the moment the cold handcuffs hit the ground, the sound ringing clearly through the suffocating silence, it marked the complete failure of Officer Brent Mallory. Colonel Teresa Maddox turned to face him, her sharp, cold eyes burning with anger, yet still full of authority and control. "You've made a very serious mistake." Teresa's voice rang out clearly, enough for everyone around to hear every word. Unlawfully detaining a serving brigadier general is not only a severe violation of federal law, but it also demonstrates a clear lack of professionalism and an inherent prejudice on your part. This has all been meticulously recorded by dozens of cameras and drones overhead. Teresa pointed to the sky, where small drones were quietly recording the entire scene. The onlookers continued to hold up their phones, their eyes focused on Brent with anger and condemnation. Those glares made him feel smaller than ever. He had never experienced such humiliation and shame in his entire career. Mallory felt his mind spinning, his legs weakening. In that instant, he realized that his career had been utterly destroyed, all because of his own blind prejudice. He was no longer the one in control of the situation. He was just a lost man, disoriented, condemned by society and facing consequences so dire there was no way to escape them. He tried to look at Colonel Teresa Maddox, his mouth opening as if to justify himself, but the words choked in his throat. He stammered out a few meaningless syllables, his eyes dazed, utterly confused. His initial arrogance had completely disappeared, replaced by a profound fear, as he realized he had unknowingly triggered a force more powerful than he could ever have imagined, the highest levels of the U.S. military. Teresa didn't give him time to speak further. Her gaze sharpened even more, her voice cutting through the air with undeniable power. "The unfortunate truth is that you have no right to detain any citizen based on vague suspicion. You certainly have no right to insult and mistreat anyone based on your ignorance and personal biases. Your actions have caused severe damage to the honor and credibility of the law enforcement community." Mallory lowered his head, unable to respond any further. Every word Teresa spoke felt like a sharp knife stabbing deep into his pride and dignity. The humiliation and regret welled up in his throat, but it was too late to change anything. Meanwhile, Cassandra Ellison maintained the calm and dignified posture of a general. She adjusted her military collar, smoothed out her uniform, and stood tall with quiet strength. Her face showed no sign of hatred or anger, only seriousness, self-respect, and power. Cassandra glanced at Brent one final time, her eyes emotionless, as though he had never existed in her life. That cold, proud demeanor made Brent feel even more humiliated than before. Before the eyes of everyone, Cassandra turned back to Teresa, giving a slight nod as a silent thank you, no words necessary. She walked slowly but steadily toward the waiting SUV. Each step she took was a powerful declaration that her dignity and self-respect had never been shaken, no matter the injustice and mistreatment she had endured. As the door of the SUV closed, Cassandra sat upright, her gaze fixed ahead, never once looking back. That image was etched into the minds of all the witnesses, becoming a living symbol of strength, resolve, and dignity that transcended all prejudice and injustice. Behind her, Brent Mallory stood frozen, his face drained of color. He could clearly hear the murmurs around him, the growing criticisms and condemnations from the crowd. He deserves this consequence. To disgrace a general, that's unacceptable. This will cost him dearly for his ignorance and prejudice. Each word felt like another stab into his already deeply wounded sense of pride. Mallory felt as though everything around him was collapsing. He knew that from this point on, his life would never be the same. In the midst of his ultimate humiliation, Brent realized one clear truth. He had lost everything simply because he stubbornly clung to misguided prejudices, and the bitterest part of it all was that he couldn't blame anyone but himself. As Cassandra Ellison calmly walked away from the scene, Brent Mallory stood frozen, unaware that the real nightmare for him was just beginning. Just hours after the incident went viral at lightning speed, Brent was urgently summoned to the police station. It was a room deep inside the building that he had never wanted to enter. The Internal Affairs Office. He sat facing Deputy Chief Alan Breyer, a man known for being the strictest and most impartial officer in the department. Alan Breyer was a veteran officer, his nearly gray hair and cold, authoritative eyes reflecting a man who had handled countless serious cases. Breyer sat in silence for a long moment, staring into Brent's eyes with an expression of cold disappointment and anger. "Brent, do you fully understand the consequences of your actions today?" Alan's voice was deep, each word heavy with authority. Brent struggled to hold Alan's gaze, but he couldn't maintain it for long. He looked down at the empty desk in front of him, awkwardly searching for a way to answer. "Sir, I was just doing my job. I thought the woman—" "The woman?" Alan interrupted sharply, his voice suddenly stern. "That woman is Brigadier General Cassandra Ellison, a senior military officer who has served this country for over 20 years. What made you think she was suspicious enough to treat her like a dangerous criminal?" Brent swallowed hard, his throat tightening. He knew he couldn't come up with any reason that would be convincing, but he still tried to defend himself. "I didn't know who she was. I just thought her attitude was challenging, and I followed protocol." Alan raised an eyebrow, his face growing even more serious, full of disappointment. "Protocol? You call detaining someone who hasn't broken the law, forcing them onto the hood of a car, and handcuffing them in front of dozens of witnesses and cameras following protocol? Don't try to justify yourself, Brent. This is clearly discriminatory behavior, and you know it." Brent fell silent, his head hanging lower. Each word Allen spoke felt like a whip striking his already wounded honor and self-respect. Under Allen's stern, angry gaze, Brent couldn't continue denying the painful truth that he had acted based on deep-rooted prejudices in his mind. Allen slid a thick file across the desk toward Brent. He glanced through it, his heart pounding when he realized it contained all the photos and footage of the incident. Allen continued coldly, his words firm and clear. "These pieces of evidence are enough to prove that not only did you violate conduct rules, but you've also severely damaged the reputation and credibility of the entire police force. The situation is completely unacceptable." Brent felt every word Allen spoke like a dagger to his self-worth. He tried to open his mouth to say something, but the words caught in his throat. Finally, he weakly blurted out, almost in despair, I'm really sorry. I didn't mean for it to go this far." Allen shook his head slowly, his gaze resolute. "Sorry, Brent, it's too late for that now. You've created an unprecedented scandal in this department's history. The media is waiting for us outside, the public is enraged, and federal agencies are putting intense pressure on us. Do you understand the consequences of this?" Brent nodded in pain. He knew there was no turning back. Everything he had built, his honor, career, and reputation, had crumbled in an instant because of one foolish and wrong decision. Allen stood up, looking directly at Brent one last time before delivering the final word. "Brent Mallory, based on all the evidence and details that have been clarified, I, on behalf of the Internal Affairs Board, hereby declare you are immediately suspended, and an official termination notice will be sent to you later today. From this moment on, you are no longer a police officer." Allen's final words rang like a death knell, completely ending Brent's career. He sat still, his face pale, eyes vacant, staring into nothingness. As Allen left the room, the door closed gently, but to Brent the sound was like the slamming shut of a door on his life, a door that he had locked himself by his own prejudices and irreversible mistakes. Brent Mallory sat there, alone and stunned, realizing that the price for his ignorance was far greater than he had ever imagined. Not just the end of his career, but the honor and trust of the entire police department. Something he knew would take a long time to restore. At the same time, Brent Mallory sat motionless, despairing in the cold internal affairs office of the police station. Hundreds of miles away, Cassandra Ellison sat quietly at a wooden table in her brother Elijah Ellison's small apartment. The room was enveloped in an unusual stillness, as though both of them were trying to escape the media storm outside. A storm that Cassandra knew all too well she would have to face sooner or later. Elijah placed a hot cup of coffee down on the table and sat across from Cassandra, his gaze thoughtful but resolute. As an experienced lawyer, Elijah was always calm in tense situations. But this time, even he could feel the immense pressure weighing down on his sister. "Cassie," Elijah began gently, his voice warm but serious. "You know this situation isn't just about you anymore, right?" Cassandra nodded slowly, her eyes lowering to the table, yet her gaze remained strong, deep in thought. She had faced countless dangerous situations in her military career, but the pressure from public opinion and the media now was far more intense. She understood that what she decided to say and do next would have a massive impact on the community and American society. "I understand that, Eli," Cassandra said quietly, her voice calm but filled with depth. "But I'm not sure I'm ready to become the center of attention like this. I don't want this to turn into a media war." Elijah leaned forward, locking eyes with his sister, his expression now full of determination and trust. "Cassie, I know you never wanted to be a symbol, but the truth is, you've already become one, whether you like it or not. What happened to you today has become the clearest symbol of injustice, prejudice, and racism that millions of Americans face every day. Cassandra looked up at her brother, a fierce internal struggle taking place in her heart. Elijah continued, his voice stronger, more convincing. You are a brigadier general in the U.S. Army, the first black woman to reach such a high rank in military history. You're not just a victim in this, Cassie. You're an opportunity for real change. Millions of people are looking at you right now, waiting for you to speak out, waiting for you to lead them. Cassandra remained silent for a long moment, feeling the weight of Elijah's words sink in. She knew he was right. She knew that remaining silent or avoiding the situation would mean allowing these misguided prejudices to continue dominating society, something she had fought against her entire life. Finally, Cassandra sighed softly, her eyes becoming more resolute than ever before. I know what you're saying is true, but Eli, do you understand how big the pressure is? Once I step out in front of the public, my life will never be the same again. Elijah smiled gently, placing his hand on hers with warmth and understanding. I understand completely, Cassie. But you also know that sometimes history forces us to step up even when we're not ready. You're not doing this just for yourself, but for the future generations who need to see an example of courage, fairness, and positive change. Cassandra looked at her brother, feeling the unwavering support in his gaze. She understood that her responsibility now wasn't just to protect her personal honor, but to stand up for all those who had to endure prejudice and injustice without the means to speak out. She nodded again, this time with clear decisiveness and determination. You're right, Eli. I can't stay silent anymore. I will speak out, I will stand in front of the public, and I will make it clear what needs to change. Elijah smiled with satisfaction, giving her hand a light squeeze of encouragement. And I'll always be behind you, Cassie. I believe you will become the leader this community needs, the one who can bring real change to the heart of American society. Cassandra smiled softly, but confidently. For the first time since the incident, she felt clearly that this was her responsibility, her role to take on. Not because she wanted to be famous, but because she knew society desperately needed the strong, clear voice of someone like her. And no matter how heavy the pressure, Cassandra knew she had no other choice but to move forward, because she wasn't just representing herself, but the millions of others who were waiting and hoping for true justice. A few days after her decisive conversation with Elijah, Cassandra Ellison walked powerfully down the long corridor leading to the Pentagon's press room. Each step she took echoed clearly, as if each stride was shattering any remaining doubts and hesitation within her. Today, Cassandra understood that she was no longer on a distant battlefield, but stepping into a far more important and challenging fight. The battle against the deep-rooted prejudices and injustices within society. The door to the press room swung open, and the flashes of cameras erupted continuously, dozens of lenses focusing directly on Cassandra. The murmurs and hushed discussions from the crowd gradually died down as she walked up to the podium, standing firm before a row of microphones waiting for her to speak. Cassandra glanced over the room full of reporters, her gaze sharp yet calm, radiating the authority and poise of a general who had weathered countless pressures. She took a deep breath, then spoke clearly, powerfully, and persuasively. My name is Cassandra Ellison, Brigadier General of the United States Army. But today I stand before you not to talk about personal achievements, but to speak about something far more important, the truth about the injustices and prejudices that still lie deep within our society. The room fell into complete silence. Every word Cassandra spoke was clear, decisive, and resonated directly in the minds of everyone present, as well as the millions watching on television. "What happened to me a few days ago is not an isolated incident," she continued, her eyes meeting the cameras aimed at her. "It is simply the most glaring example of how our system still harbors deep-seated biases, where a soldier, a person who has devoted their life to defending this country, can be treated like a criminal simply because of the color of their skin." Her voice grew sharper, without hesitation or doubt. "I am not here today to apologize or beg for sympathy from anyone. I am here to say that justice is not something we should have to beg for or negotiate. Justice is something that must be guaranteed, clearly and absolutely, regardless of skin color, status, or any other factor." Cassandra paused for a moment, allowing her words to sink deeper into the minds of her listeners. Then she continued, her voice stronger than ever. "We must acknowledge the truth that racism is not just a problem of a few misguided individuals, but a systemic issue that has infiltrated many layers of society. If we do not face this truth head-on, injustices like the one I've just experienced will continue to happen, with thousands, millions of others who do not have a voice like mine." She scanned the room, realizing that dozens of focused gazes were fixed on her. A strong sense of responsibility rose within her, urging her to continue. "Therefore, I demand that this not just be a public debate, but a call to action from all of us, from the citizens, from law enforcement, and especially from the government. We must enact real change. We must ensure that justice is no longer a privilege for some, but a right for everyone." Cassandra's words reverberated powerfully, causing the room to fall into a heavy, emotional silence. Every sentence she spoke felt like a direct challenge to injustice and prejudice, unwavering and unyielding. "Finally," Cassandra said, her voice lowering but still filled with authority, "I want to send a clear message to all those who still hold misguided prejudices. This country cannot become great while such injustices persist. It is time for all of us to face the truth, stand up, and take action to change. And if anyone still doubts our ability to change, look at me standing here, a black woman, a general, a citizen of the United States, to know that we will never again remain silent in the face of injustice." As she finished her speech, Cassandra stood still at the podium, her gaze still strong and resolute. The Pentagon conference room fell into total silence, the only sounds being the click of cameras and the heavy breaths of the hundreds witnessing history. In that moment, Cassandra knew that, despite the enormous pressure and responsibility ahead, she had truly become a powerful symbol of justice, someone society needed, and someone who would bring about the real change that everyone had been waiting for. Immediately after Cassandra stepped down from the podium at the Pentagon, her sharp words spread at lightning speed, creating an unstoppable wave in the heart of America. From Washington, D.C. to Atlanta, from New York to Los Angeles, thousands of people marched peacefully in the streets, holding signs with her name and chanting slogans demanding justice and widespread change in society. National media covered the story non-stop, broadcasting the statements Cassandra made and the justified outrage of the public. Her image, a strong and resolute general, became a powerful symbol of courage in the face of injustice. People from all walks of life, students, teachers, doctors, soldiers, even the most ordinary citizens, felt that Cassandra's story resonated with their own struggles. At the same time, pressure began to build toward the U.S. Congress. Politicians from both parties, who had often disagreed deeply in the past, now had no choice but to respond quickly. The situation had gone far beyond their control, forcing the highest leaders to admit that the issue of racial discrimination was no longer a singular story, but a national issue that needed immediate resolution. In tense congressional meetings, many lawmakers stood to directly quote Cassandra's speech, emphasizing that the time had come to end the injustices and prejudices that were embedded in law enforcement agencies. With strong public consensus, a special bill, named the Ellison Protocol, was quickly drafted and brought to urgent discussions in both the Senate and the House of Representatives. Under the immense pressure from public opinion and the media, Congress could delay no longer. The Senate Majority Leader stood before the public declaring, "Today, we are not simply discussing a bill. Today, we must recognize that justice is the fundamental foundation of this nation. The Ellison Protocol will ensure that every citizen of the United States, regardless of who they are, where they come from, or the color of their skin, will be protected equally and fairly under the law." After intense emotional debates, the Ellison Protocol was finally passed with overwhelming support. The bill called for widespread reforms in the national police system, including mandatory racial sensitivity training, transparency in investigating cases of discrimination, and stringent oversight of law enforcement at local agencies. This event marked a historic turning point in the effort to address racial discrimination, with a strong legacy left by Cassandra Ellison, the woman who dared to speak out in the midst of a media storm to change an entire system. While society was being shaken to its core, Brent Mallory, the man who had unwittingly become the symbol of prejudice and error, was now left in silence in his dimly lit apartment. Every time he turned on the TV, he saw himself on the news, accompanied by harsh condemnations from society. The feelings of shame, humiliation, and fear overwhelmed his mind as he realized that his mistake had not only destroyed his own life, but also triggered a serious national reckoning, forcing America to confront a painful issue it had long avoided. As for Cassandra, she observed the rapid changes unfolding with the calm and strength she was known for. She knew that her responsibility had not ended with that speech. More than ever, she felt the weight of the role society had placed upon her, not just as a soldier, but as a trailblazer in the fight for true justice and equality. She sat in front of the TV screen, watching thousands of people marching peacefully in the streets across America, her eyes filled with emotion. Cassandra understood that what was happening wasn't her achievement alone, but the collective power of millions of Americans who had waited too long for change. In that moment, Cassandra knew she had crossed an important threshold. She had not only spoken out for herself, but she had helped many others find their voices. And now, the powerful resonance from society had become the clearest evidence that justice was not only something that needed to be spoken of, but something that had to be enacted decisively and unmistakably, never to be delayed again. As the streets were filled with people marching in support of Cassandra and calling for justice, Brent Mallory sat alone in his dark, dimly lit apartment, completely detached from the world outside, which was in turmoil. The chants calling for change from the streets filtered in through the half-open window like direct accusations aimed at him, each sound suffocating him, making it hard to breathe. Brent held in his hands the official letter from the police department, his gaze blankly drifting over the cold, clear words. "Dear Mr. Brent Mallory, after a thorough review of the evidence and circumstances surrounding the events of June 14th, the Internal Affairs Board officially announces you have severely violated professional ethics and have been terminated from the police force, effective immediately." Each word in the letter felt like a sharp blade cutting into him. Brent let the letter fall onto the table, his hands trembling, his heart pounding, filled with a deep sense of bitterness and disappointment. He looked up at the TV screen, his face appearing repeatedly, always accompanied by harsh headlines and scathing condemnation. racist police officer, symbol of injustice, the one who tarnished the honor of the police force. These comments echoed constantly from television channels, from expert debates, even from ordinary citizens interviewed. Each word seemed to strip away his entire life and honor before the eyes of the nation. He stood up, walking slowly to the window, gazing out at the crowded street. His eyes were lost, filled with despair. In his mind, there was only one question echoing over and over. When did I become this person? He remembered moments from his earlier years when he first joined the police force, filled with zeal and ideals about justice. Yet, over the years, he hadn't realized how deeply prejudices had quietly seeped into his mind, growing stronger with time. The times he doubted someone just because of their skin color, the times he abused his power and dismissed it, excusing himself. Now, all of it was clear to him, forcing him to face a bitter truth he had long avoided. He collapsed onto the couch, burying his face in his hands, overwhelmed with guilt and regret. Brent knew that the issue wasn't just one mistake in the heat of the moment, but the result of a long process where he had allowed prejudices to guide his thoughts and actions. He had thought he was just doing his duty, but in reality, he had allowed himself to lose the dignity and justice he had once sworn to protect. His phone buzzed incessantly beside him, filled with angry messages and criticisms from strangers, reminding him that he had permanently lost society's respect. Brent closed his eyes, his breathing heavy. In this moment, he truly realized that he, too, was a victim of the ignorance and persistent prejudices deep within society, a prejudice he had unconsciously accepted and allowed to lead his life. The room was eerily silent. Only the painful sighs of Brent filled the air. Now, he understood that he could no longer blame the circumstances or anyone else. This mistake, these consequences were his own doing, born from his own blindness and indifference. Brent realized that this wasn't just the collapse of his career. It was a painful and clear wake-up call to him and to society about the insidious racism that many still deny or pretend not to see. On the TV screen, Cassandra Ellison appeared once more, calm, strong, and determined as she spoke to thousands of people. Brent quietly watched the image of the woman he had once looked down upon, now a powerful symbol of the change that American society was moving toward. In that moment, Brent realized that, no matter how painful it was, this event was necessary to awaken everyone, including himself. And though he would never regain what he had lost, he knew that this bitter lesson would forever be a part of his life, serving as a reminder that justice and compassion have no place for prejudice and hatred. While Brent Mallory sat alone in his darkened apartment, reflecting on his past mistakes, a wave of positive change was sweeping across the country, awakening hearts and minds that had long been immersed in indifference. The courageous actions of Captain Miguel Herrera during the recent incident had not been forgotten. Videos capturing the moment he stood up to defend Cassandra Ellison were widely shared, turning Miguel into a living symbol of bravery, integrity, and the courage of a true soldier. At Fort Mitchell, Miguel Herrera received special recognition from the military and the local community. During an official ceremony, in front of hundreds of fellow soldiers and local citizens, Miguel humbly stepped up to accept the award, his calm demeanor underscoring his belief that he was simply doing what was right according to the ethics and responsibility of a soldier. "I haven't done anything extraordinary," Miguel said softly, his gaze sincere. "I only did what anyone facing injustice should do. That is to speak out and not remain silent, because justice never exists in silence." His words were met with enthusiastic applause, echoing throughout the room, touching the hearts of many, those who were slowly awakening to their own responsibility to address the injustices and prejudices in society. Meanwhile, Cassandra Ellison continued her powerful community outreach efforts, tirelessly spreading the message of dignity, self-respect, and inner strength to all sectors of society. One sunny day, she visited a small high school in the outskirts of Atlanta, where students eagerly awaited the chance to meet the woman who had awakened the entire nation. As Cassandra entered the auditorium, the room fell into an unusually quiet hush. The students watched her intently, their eyes filled with curiosity and admiration. Cassandra stepped up to the podium, offering a warm, friendly smile, easing the initial tension in the room. "Hello, everyone. I'm Cassandra Ellison. Today, I'm not standing here as a brigadier general. Today, I'm here as a friend to talk to you about self-respect and the inner strength that lies within each of us." A young girl sitting in the front row raised her hand, her voice soft but full of emotion. "Ma'am, when you were unjustly arrested, weren't you scared?" Cassandra looked at the girl and smiled gently, her understanding evident. "Yes, I was afraid. I'm human. But the most important thing is not letting that fear strip away our dignity and our posture. Remember this. We can't always control how others treat us, but we can always control how we respond to it." A boy sitting at the back stood up boldly, his eyes filled with thought. "But what if we stay silent, ma'am? Isn't silence sometimes safer?" Cassandra shook her head gently, her gaze resolute. "Sometimes silence is the easier choice, but it's not always the right one. Silence in the face of injustice will only allow injustice to grow stronger. You don't need to shout to be heard, but you must always speak up to protect the truth and justice. Always remember, remaining silent in the face of wrong is also a form of complicity." The atmosphere in the auditorium grew more emotional, as each student clearly felt the deep message Cassandra was delivering. Another girl stood up, her voice full of determination. "You've shown us that anyone can be strong no matter the circumstances. But how do we keep that strength, ma'am?" Cassandra nodded gently, feeling a sense of pride as she heard the question. "True strength is not in muscles or power. It's in maintaining our dignity and self-respect in all circumstances. Always live in a way that when you look in the mirror every day, you can proudly tell yourself, 'I lived right today. I didn't remain silent in the face of injustice, and I always respected my own worth.'" The meeting ended with deep emotion and solidarity from all the students. As Cassandra stepped down from the podium, she saw the faces of young people lit up with newfound hope and belief. She understood that the message she wanted to convey had truly reached the hearts of the next generation. As she left the school, Cassandra turned to look back one last time, her heart filled with a strong sense of hope for the future. She realized that the experience she had gone through, despite the pain, had sparked a wave of positive change, one that nothing could stop now. Walking down the road ahead, Cassandra knew that her responsibility was far from over. But the most important thing she had gained today was the unshakable belief that from now on, she was no longer alone. Because thousands, millions of others, especially the younger generations, would walk with her, spreading the message of dignity and justice everywhere. As the sound of applause and the pure laughter of students still echoed in her mind, Cassandra quietly returned to her familiar small house in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. Each step she took was gentle yet firm, as if each footstep was gradually blending with the memories and deep reflections in her heart. She stopped before a small table pressed against the wall, where old, faded photographs were kept. Cassandra picked up a photo of her father, Elijah Ellison Sr., a soldier who had served in the Vietnam War. In the photo, her father wore an old military uniform, his face stern yet kind, his eyes seeming to look directly at her from the distant past, deep and profound. Memories of her father flooded her mind, vivid and more real than ever. Cassandra recalled the countless stories he had shared with her, stories of courage on the battlefield, of camaraderie, but more painful than all were the stories of the discrimination he had suffered on the very soil he had sacrificed his youth to protect. She remembered the days when he returned from the war, covered in scars from the battle, but what hurt him the most wasn't the physical wounds, but the suspicious, prejudiced looks and harsh words from the very people he had risked his life to defend. "Cassie, you need to remember," he had told her one quiet afternoon, his voice low and thoughtful. "The hardest battle isn't the one on distant battlefields. The hardest battle is the one within the human heart, the battle against prejudice and racism." Cassandra set the photo down, gently wiping off a thin layer of dust on the frame. Her eyes sparkled, a mix of emotion and pride filling her as she realized that now she truly understood the deep meaning of her father's words. She slowly walked to the small balcony, gazing at the sunset as it began to cast its warm glow over the city. The last rays of the day stretched across the horizon, bringing with them a sense of calm, peace, and hope for a new future. For the first time in her life, Cassandra realized that she was no longer fighting on distant battlefields, no longer facing bombs or invisible enemies. Now, her greatest battle was here, at home, where the country had finally begun to listen to the voices that had long been silenced. She understood that the fight against racism had never been easy, and it would certainly never be fully over. But each time she or anyone else dared to stand up and fight, each time a young person was inspired to speak out against injustice, that was when society took one more step toward real justice. Standing in front of the sunset, Cassandra closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath of the fresh air. A sense of relief and hope flooded her heart. She knew that although this fight was endless, she was not alone. The people around her, the young people who were starting to awaken, starting to act, they were the most vivid proof of the powerful change happening in this country. Cassandra smiled softly, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon, her heart filled with unwavering faith in the future. "Dad, I know this fight will never stop, but I also know that every small step forward today is worth it, and every change, no matter how small, carries great meaning." She stood silently for a few more minutes, letting the gentle evening breeze of the sunset sweep away all her worries and troubles. Cassandra knew that today's story was not the end, but the beginning of a new journey, a long but meaningful journey that she and many others would walk together to build a fairer, better society. The sunlight slowly sank down, giving way to the quiet darkness descending over the city. But Cassandra no longer feared the darkness, for she knew that in that darkness there would always be small but powerful rays of light, rays of courage, determination, and the hope that she and her father had nurtured together throughout their lives. And in this moment, standing in the soft breeze of the evening, Cassandra understood that, finally, her homeland had truly begun to listen, and that was the greatest victory she could ever hope for. Thus, we have just gone through an emotional journey with the story of Brigadier General Cassandra Ellison, the resilient woman who dared to stand up against injustice and racism, becoming a powerful symbol for positive change in American society. Her story reminds us that justice is not something to beg for, but something that must be guaranteed in a clear and absolute manner, fairly for everyone. What do you think of Cassandra's actions in the story? If you were Cassandra, what would you do in a similar situation? Leave a comment below to share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share the video, and spread this powerful message to more people. And subscribe to our channel to continue following the deep, meaningful stories we share. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to seeing you in the next videos.